When I was a kid, I was on this show called Jerry's Place. The show has basically been erased from the public's consciousness, so don't rack your brain if you don't remember it. We worked for a small Canadian studio, hoping to market the show to an American audience. Half of Season 1 never even aired in Canada, not after the incident. The show followed a fairly typical formula. There was a father and a mother character, wise yet silly parents, who dispensed advice and hugs in equal parts. An older sibling who was aloof and angsty and brought friends over to add color to our small cast. The two younger siblings, one of them very young and the other around 9 or 10, who were there to make hijinks and generally move the story along. The later was me. I was the middle child, and I was usually responsible for comic relief or having some part in the week's story. The two adult characters were Linda and Mike, and they were actually pretty cool. Mike was a lifelong actor who always had a word of advice or a smile if you felt scared. As someone who grew up without a father, Mike was the person I used as a model for what a man should be, though it probably became intertwined with his character on the show to a certain degree. Linda was great too, a mom with kids of her own who was always looking after us when we weren't shooting on set and making sure that we got enough to eat. My own mother was working 2 jobs to keep the lights on at home, so there were evenings where I would join Linda and her children for family dinners until my mom could pick me up. Linda and Mike were almost like surrogate parents to me during that time of my life, and Rachel and Mark almost became like adopted siblings. Rachel was the older sister, angsty and above it all on camera, but she was always very nice off screen. Rachel would run lines with me when I was scared, and always helped me when I needed something. She was actually 19, though she played a 16-year-old, and on the nights when Linda couldn't take me, I would hang out with Rachel until my mom came and picked me up. Mark, the younger boy, was 6, and we weren't too far off in age, really. We had similar interests, and we would often sit around off screen and talk about Ninja Turtles or Power Rangers, or play Game Boys together. In many ways, those 5 people became family to me for that year and a half. It makes the rest of the story all the harder to tell. It was a typical day of shooting. We had finished what would have been Season 1, and were shooting some scenes for Season 2. The network had been pleased with our viewership so far, so a second season seemed to be in the cards. With the second season, though, came a live audience. This was the 90s, and live audiences were all the rage. The first season had been live a few times, for select episodes, but this season would have a live audience throughout. The presence of an audience was a bit of a distraction, and often led to Mark and I playing it up a little bit for their attention. We had been asked to ignore them, but we were young, and the laughter of adults meant a lot to us. We were in episode 6 of Season 2, when a very different audience wandered in. I remember it perfectly. The event gouged into my mind surgically. We were setting up for the opening scene when the stage door opened and a crowd of people filed in. There were about 20 of them in all. Our audiences tended to be small, and I can remember not seeing any kids or strollers as they filed into the dark rows. Our show was loved by people of all ages. You could usually count on a few kids being in the live audience during recording. Usually they brought the house lights up, allowing us to see the audience, but today the crowd sat in shadow. Mark whispered to me about it, saying they looked a little creepy, all huddled up in the dark like that. I told him it was probably just something new the directors were doing to make us ignore them. We set up for the shot, and I found myself looking at the crowd out of the corner of my eye. It wasn't that dark out there. Not really. But the whole audience sat in a small sea of shadows that seemed to crowd around them. They didn't talk. They didn't shuffle. They just hunched there and waited for us to begin. We rolled the opening. Jerry's Place is filmed before a live studio audience. And away we went. As Mike came on stage, the titular Jerry, I had expected the crowd to clap as they usually did when a character came onto scene. They didn't, though. They just sat there, waiting. The director looked back at them and shrugged, whispering something to his assistant. Mike looked up at the audience strangely too, but he was a pro and didn't let it mess him up. Linda and Rachel, Megan and Bonnie on the show, were watching TV as Mike walked in from the kitchen and delivered his lines. They cued Mark and me to run downstairs and begin the show's problem, a broken toy that was important to me. By the end of the show, Mark would have saved enough money to buy me a new one, and I would learn a lesson about sharing. Everyone at home would feel warm and fuzzy as my brother and I hugged it out, and the show would end on a high note. At least, that's how it should have gone. I came downstairs yelling about my toy, a model airplane, and Mark was right behind me in typical little brother fashion. Mike looked at the plane and asked if I couldn't just use it like this, as I hit my mark and prepared to deliver my character's catchphrase. Catchphrases were prominent in the 90s. They were also very marketable, and my catchphrase was supposed to elicit laughs from the audience. Until then, they had just been sitting quietly. I wish maybe they had stayed quiet. Play with a broken toy? That's gonna be a deal breaker for me, Pops, I said, looking at the audience as I did so. That's when they started to laugh. I was expecting a chuckle, maybe even a full-fledged laugh or two. The audience surprised me by emanating a hearty, canned laughter, the kind you hear on sitcoms when the real audience might be too much. Mike started to give his next line, but the audience just kept laughing. I looked at them, my face still holding that mischievous smile that it always did after my catchphrase, and saw that the shadowy crowd was laughing and heaving in unison. The shadowy mob was hitching and chuckling as one being, and as I watched, I felt my smile faltering. Mike tried to give his next line again, but the laughter overtopped him. The director said something to his assistant, and the man brought out a cue card that read, "Quiet, please." He held it high, right in front of the audience, but they just kept on laughing. Their laughter had begun to make me uneasy. The longer they laughed, the more uniform and unchanging their laughter became. It should have been impossible for someone to laugh like that for that long, but they laughed through it. The laughter never rose or fell in volume, just the mad, canned laughter I would become familiar with later in life. It was emotionless and inhuman, and it just continued to pour out of them as they huddled in the shadows. The assistant shouted at the crowd then, the director calling for the cameras to be cut. One of the cameramen, I can't remember his name, but he was always kind of a jokester, turned the camera to film the crowd. Maybe he thought it would be great for a gag reel or something. Perhaps he thought the studio was playing a joke on us. But whatever he was thinking, he had an excellent seat for what happened next. When the assistant's shouts failed to gain any attention, he walked into the seats and started yelling at the crowd. That's when his angry shouts turned into overwhelming laughter, and he too started chuckling. The director turned and started shouting at the crowd to be quiet, even as he shouted at his assistant to come down. We had all started milling about close to our marks so we could start again. I couldn't help but notice Rachel and Linda on the couch, and how Linda had a protective arm around her. They looked scared, and despite being trained to stay close to our marks, I went over and sat with them, wanting to be in that protective bubble. A stagehand had gone into the audience to get the assistant back, but now he was sitting and chuckling right along with the rest of them. It was that same canned laughter, but they sounded like lunatics now. They were consistent, unchanging in pitch or fervor, and it was all becoming too spooky for me. Mark came and sat beside me, and I wrapped a brotherly arm around him just as Linda had. "I don't like it. They're scaring me," Mark cried as big tears rolled down his cheek. I told him that I was pretty scared too, and when Mike came up to put his hand on the back of the couch, I felt safe knowing that he was there. As we sat and watched, another stagehand went up. He grasped the first one by the arm, pulling at him as he tried to get him to leave, but soon he too was laughing and grinning as he took a seat beside the other one. After that, the director forbade anyone else to go up. The crew sat huddled together on the edge of the stage as they tried to figure out what was happening. The director sent a stagehand to get security, but the stagehand found the doors to be locked. None of the keys would open them, and he came back white-faced, skirting the audience, as if whatever they had might be catching. The director sent someone to see if the roof access was open, but they discovered the same thing. Keys didn't work, and the hatch was locked. Someone tried a landline in the back, but found no dial tone. This was before cell phones had become a norm, but the director had a bag phone that he tried. Same thing, no dial tone, no call would go out. And all the while, they laughed. Even after an hour, they still just laughed. The director and some of the crew had come to sit around the couch. They had brought items from the food service table, and we all just kind of had a picnic. It would have been nice had the creepy laughing shadow people not been staring at us the whole time. As we ate, I noticed that some of the crew had stayed away and seemed to be eating on the outskirts. They kept looking at the crowd, some of them staring, and when I asked the director about them, he shook his head. One of them claims that his father is sitting in the audience. "What?" Mike asked, his mouth full of sandwich. "He says the man in the front row near the middle is his father. He says it can't be him, because he died of lung cancer last year, but it definitely looks like him. He says that the laughing man will look at him every now and again and try to wave him over. He knows he shouldn't go, but he says that it's hard not to go every time the guy waves at him." "That's nuts," Linda breathed. Each of them has a story like that, the director said. For Carrie, he pointed to the redhead with the ponytail, it's her girlfriend who left for New Mexico and never came back. For Steve, he pointed to the guy with the salt and pepper crew cut, it's his sister who stopped talking to him after his parents left him everything in their will. They all have someone, all of them thinking they might, but as he spoke, we saw Carrie get up and take a step towards the chuckling crowd. Steve grabbed at her, but she shrugged him off and walked towards the crowd like someone in a dream. She embraced one of the shadowy masses and then sat next to them, chuckling and smiling as her butt pressed into the seat. After Steve left too, the director decided to take action. He told one of the hands near us to turn on the house lights. He wanted lights on the crowd so we could see who they were. Maybe they would stop laughing if their covers were blown, and this would be all over, and we could all get back to work. He still seemed to think that this might be a prank, though not a very funny one, and wanted an end to it already. Some of the stage hands went to get things set up, but we all kept looking at that quietly chuckling behemoth. Mark had fallen asleep somehow, and I kept my arm wrapped around him as though I might stand between him and the tide should they change. I was still munching absent-mindedly at fruit from the food table, and I didn't notice Rachel getting up until my bowl of honeydew almost tipped over. Linda grabbed her wrist, anchoring her to the couch, but I could see that her eyes were big and starry when I looked up. Her blonde hair bobbed a little as she scanned the crowd, and Linda started asking her what she was looking for. I saw someone up there, someone I haven't seen in a very long... But she gasped harshly and said, It's him! It's him! Oh my God! She was pulling against Linda's hand, but Linda refused to let her go. Who, Rachel? Who is it? Linda asked, trying to restrain the girl as Mike moved to help. It's my dad! My dad's up there! He looks just like he did on the photo Mom has on her dresser. He hasn't changed a bit. I looked at the crowd, trying to see who she was talking about, but failed. Rach, your dad died when you were born. Your mother told me about the accident. It can't be him. But it is, Rachel almost screamed, pitching her body from side to side as she tried to break free. Mike and Linda held her tightly, and I scooted closer to Mark so Mike could sit on the couch. The two of them sat there and held her as she sobbed for them to let her go. She used a lot of swear words as she thrashed about, but they refused to let go of her. When she finally stopped, she sat crying into Linda's shoulder as the two of them hugged her tightly. Someone yelled down from the catwalk then, and the stage was suddenly awash with light. The overheads were unbearably bright, and as they were all lit at once, I remember tinting my eyes with my hands so I didn't go blind. We had used them for a beach scene a few times when rain caused us not to shoot on location, and I can remember thinking that they were so much brighter than the real sun. They lit up every corner of the set, but I realized I had been wrong as I squinted at the seats. Every corner but that one, it seemed. The seats were still in a pool of shadow, but when the light hit them, everything changed. The low chuckling became a strange hybrid of screaming and deep booming laughter, the kind of laughter you heard in an insane asylum, the kind of laughter you heard in hell. The people in the seats never moved, but the darkness did. It plumed out like a fog and started rolling towards us. Those sitting near the seats were hit, and I could hear them laughing as they fell to their knees and clutched their stomachs. The director shouted at the crew to kill the lights, but it was much too late. The darkness was angry now, and it was no longer satisfied with the few people it had in the seats. It was coming for us. Mike grabbed Mark and I, lifting us up in his strong arms, and started running backstage. He turned to yell at Linda as she fought with Rachel, the girl trying to free herself again. She was straining towards the fog, and it was creeping in to get both of them. Mike yelled for her to let Rachel go if she wouldn't come, but Linda refused to leave her there. She strained and pulled at the girl, but Rachel was apparently stronger than she looked. It didn't matter a moment later as the fog rolled in, and they were both little more than chuckling shadows. Mike ran to the back, Mark crying and asking what was going on. He had woken up when Mike picked him up, and Mike was looking frantically for some way to escape. Mike saw a window and lifted a piece of wood to smash it out. As he brought the wood down, however, he might as well have been hitting concrete, because the board bounced off, splinters flying. The dark fog was rolling past the set walls now, and Mike was almost out of options. Mark and I just stood there, eyes roving around like scared dogs, trying to make sense of what was happening. Finally, Mike settled on a closet. It was full of brooms and mops, but we didn't have time to move any at that point. Mike pushed us in and sighed as he saw how much room was left. As the fog plumed behind him, he slammed the door and left us in total darkness. His laughter started a few minutes later, and the sound nearly drove us mad as we huddled in the tiny closet. Mark and I hunched, arms wrapped around each other, expecting that we would both begin to laugh any minute. We sat like that for a long time. I have no idea how long exactly, but both of us fell asleep to the sound of Mike's choking laughter. When I woke up, I was in a hospital. My mother was asleep in the chair next to my bed. I got the whole story a few days later. My mother didn't know much, but she had come to the set only to find all the doors locked and police trying to get in. Once they had gotten in, some of them started laughing and couldn't stop. The paramedics and the fire department had come. After searching the place with breathing equipment, they found Mark and I and brought us safely out. There was nothing wrong with either of us, not physically, but the two of us had been catatonic for the last 3 days. The man from the studio, the one in the pristine suit and the oiled hair, told me a very different story. He said that it was some kind of gas leak and claimed that most of those present had been hallucinating due to the gas. The audience, cast and crew had all died due to gas inhalation, and Mark and I had been lucky to survive. Our parents had both signed non-disclosure agreements. We would promise not to talk about anything in exchange for a large amount of financial compensation. My mother and I needed the money, now that the show was going to be canceled. Both our parents signed, and Mark and I went our separate ways. The whole event was deemed a tragic accident, and I never worked in showbiz again. That would be the end of this story, if it weren't for the email I received a week ago. I'm in my 30s now, and about a week ago, I got a Facebook request from Mark. I'd expected that he wanted to catch up, have a beer, and share some old stories, but his first message was far from what I expected. He sent me a message a few seconds later, and after accepting, he sent me 7 words. Are they still laughing for you, too? We met up for that beer the next day. Mark was older, but far from doing well. The guy looked rough, borderline homeless, and seemed eternally looking around to see who was near him. He asked if I still heard the laughter. I told him I hadn't, not since that day all those years ago. He said that for him, it had never stopped. He would wake up to see shadowy figures at the end of his bed, that canned laughter bubbling from their dark lips. He said Rachel and Linda and Mike were right out front, 2 white teeth smiling as they laughed and laughed. His parents hadn't believed him. They thought it was just bad dreams because of the incident. The drugs the shrink gave him just meant that he was a drooling zombie, as the laughing apparitions chuckled on and on. He started using young. First it was alcohol. His dad had a cabinet in the living room. Then drugs when he was in high school. He stole prescription medication, used blends of different drugs, drank himself into oblivion, but nothing helped. Every night they were waiting for him. Every night he screamed until they disappeared with the light of day or the arrival of someone else. Just wanted to see if you'd found a way to make them stop too, big brother, he said sadly as he left the bar. He killed himself a week later. Put a gun in his mouth, and the rest is pretty easy to figure out. I envy him now. I envy that he had the strength to do what needed to be done. About a week ago, I woke up to the sound of that canned laughter that always creeped me out in sitcoms. I fumbled for the remote, thinking I'd just left the TV on, but as the TV came to life, I saw them. They were arrayed at the foot of my bed, their bodies made of living darkness, made all the murkier by the light of the TV, and their laughter went on and on. Mark was among them, his unkempt hair now a raven mane of living shadow. Mike was there too, and Linda, and Rachel, all of them laughing and laughing as I lay in bed, frozen in terror. They left with the sun, and I got up to write this. I don't know how long I can take this. I'm afraid to go to sleep, afraid to see them, but I'm too afraid to take Mark's way out. I see him amongst them, laughing and laughing like an audience in hell, and I wonder if I'll join them at the end too. I'm afraid to go to sleep, afraid to be awake, afraid to see their faces, and afraid of running into them again. My eyes are getting heavy. The 4th cup of coffee is jittering in my hand. I wonder if it hurts to laugh forever. Perhaps I'll find out soon. Good evening, everyone. It's me, Dr. Plague. Thank you so much for joining me for tonight's story. Well, this is the first one. This is the laughing audience I've been telling you about. I hope you like the story because there's many more to come. Who knows, if you guys like them enough, it might push me to finally finish this story. I have so many more laughing audience stories, and the book is so close to being done, I just need to get off my butt and do it finally. Let's go ahead and thank our sponsors before we sign off for the night. Thanks to Leslie Lou Riddle for being our Spooky Skeleton tier contributor. Thanks, Leslie. We just couldn't do it without you. If you'd like to support the show, come on down to Patreon. For just $5 a month, you too can be one of my Spooky Skeleton tier contributors. Have your name read out at the end of every video and every TikTok that I do. Spooky Skeleton tier contributors also get to suggest a story for my Monday story, so keep that in mind. I'd love to see some of the things you'd like me to read on there. You can also go to Amazon. I have a link below. Might I suggest Stragview stories? 30 prison short stories from that mythical Stragview prison. Can't beat that. And as always, thanks for stopping by. Dr. Plague, signing off. Have a wonderful evening.